So, let's get to poetry. Our program begins this evening with poetry, first read by Sebastian Merrill, then followed by Carl Phillips. Help me welcome Sebastian.
Thank you to the Emily Dickinson Museum for having me here. Thank you to all of you, both in person and online. Such a gift and a pleasure to get to read with you tonight. I'll be reading from my book, Ghost Seeds, which I think of in a way as a book-length poem told in multiple voices. Girl Ghost, you bloom in the air when our father utters the half-halted phrase of your name, the exhalation of ha, cut off by a quick revision to my name, my man's name. You shimmer in pronouns, in the half-said shh of she, in the red edge of her slipping into the sibilance of his. When our father calls me sweetie or honey, it's not me he calls to, it's you. You, myself. You, my lost. You, my ghost. Inverse twin, lost sister, like our dead, you live in memory. Our grandmother's clouded eyes saw you instead of me. In the cold, my bones still ache along your long-healed fractures. I spent years distancing myself from you, but here, in our grandparents' home, I want to pull you close. When the spring snows melted, I left my apartment in the city, headed north through twisting back roads over mountains, stopped to pee, squatting behind bushes, until finally I arrived here, on this main island. The cottage still overlooks the rocky coast. Every dawn, I paddle through the wind-whipped waves of the thread of life ledges, those jagged rocks the seals love. I find wonder even in the swirls of floating plastic, deflated balloons, grocery bags, forlorn shoes. Do you remember the summers we spent here? The swimming lessons in the frigid water, the sea stars and the tidal pools? My grief for our grandparents has grown without you. Also, all the sea stars have disappeared. Where do we converge, overlay each other like a poorly developed film, our two images a blur of light and form? Where and when do we divide? I think of Persephone, torn between two worlds, hidden beneath the earth, both alive and dead, stolen from herself, estranged. I like to imagine you as an underground goddess, lost, yes, but also powerful, unaged. So this book began as this letter to a former self, and at a certain point in the writing, it began to feel unfair to not give her a voice as well. And so a series of poems emerged, told in the voice of this girl ghost. And I imagined her through the lens of Persephone stuck in the underworld. So most of the poems, most of the pages in this book are untitled, but she gets titles, and they're all the same. So I'll read one of hers. Ghost, Persephone. Tied though I may be to this dark hold of the earth, let me speak. My story is not yet complete. My path sluices through granite and limestone into caverns of water and night. You imagine me as Persephone. I am her and more. Stuck like her beneath the world you see, overshadowed by a mother's grief. Sometimes I feel it too, the sting of loss, all that I could have been. But here, in the deep recesses of stone, out of sight of stars and green, I will seek a heaven all to myself. I will learn to sing. Wake up before dawn, launch my kayak with the sun, paddle out along the island's windward side. The cliffs glow rosy in the early light. I survey the coast, the wall of seemingly impenetrable rock, searching for the dark aperture of the sea cave I found last summer. I hear it first, the sea surge through the narrow opening. The tide is right, my boat slim enough to fit, so I surf in on the swell through the black mouth into a cavern of glistening stone. The sea swirls around me, echoes. Light filters in, illuminates the vast space. Overhead, a rustle of bats. And in between space, the surprise of air within the press of earth and water. Across from the entrance, the curve of stone squeezes into a dark tunnel. If I could follow this river into the earth, would it lead me to you, your underworld? I backpaddle away from the clothes, too tight to fit even my narrow hull. The air sucks in and out, a giant's breath. So this is a book that's obsessed with gender. And in the course of writing it, I started to really get curious about this word gender itself. And I wanted to extract it from this binary of male, female, masculine, feminine. And you know that feeling when you repeat a word over and over and it starts to lose its meaning? I wanted to do that with the word gender itself. So there's two primary voices in this manuscript, the voice of the trans-masculine speaker and the voice of the girl ghost. And then there's a third voice, and I think it might be the voice of gender itself. So I'll read one of those. Your gender is a punk house party with 100 bikes locked to the chain link fence outside. Your gender is Peter Pan. Your gender is a succulent in a pot the color of fresh turmeric. Your gender is a wet dog. Your gender smells like a lavender and patchouli candle, a waft of warm buckwheat. Your gender is an egg hatching, that first tap and crack. Your gender is a kiss goodnight, the click of a light, the electric razor buzz. Your gender is a kindergarten portrait in a seafoam green stegosaurus frame, a ceramic harbor seal with a cracked left flipper and a goofy grin. Your gender is an exclamation point, an aquamarine crystal. Your gender is sponsored by the color pink. Please wait. Your gender is not in our database. Thanks all. I do have a little bit of fun with gender in this book. Let's go back to the sea. Bound by rocky headlands, this northern coast is hard and sharp. Few beaches greet the pounding surf. I paddle through an ocean studded with islands, each a small world in itself. Birch Island frames little harbor, the sheltered waters home to herons, cormorants, and eiders. Hay Island holds two hand-hewn houses. Ospreys nest on the tip of Crow Island. I gentle my speed through the thread of life, watch the spring-born seal pups swim fearlessly alongside their cautious mothers. After paddling through the thread, I land on Thrumcap Island's rare beach. At high tide, the water shines turquoise above the creamy sand, a mix of stone and crushed shells, oysters, whelk, blue mussels, snails, and clams. I carry my boat high above the reaching waves, tear off my shirt, dive into the relentless sea. Buoyed by the salt water, I float weightless and free until I no longer feel the cold. I emerge goose-pimpled, lie on the sand to soak in the sun. As I drift toward sleep, a woman paddles onto the beach. I recognize her face, even though we haven't seen her for 10 years at least. You used to play kick the can with her and the other island girls. She doesn't know me at first, and nervous, shy, I don't offer a greeting. Until, with a flicker, she sees you within me. Is it you? She asks. I stand up fast, nod, cross my arms over my scarred, flat chest. It's confusing, introducing myself to someone you knew, but she's friendly enough. So we stand in the surf and watch the gulls wheel over the churning waves. Here, in this one place, both you and I have lived. You luster, flash bright. I branch away from you, then back, then away. Tell me, am I the fig and you the wasp? Am I sound and you echo? Am I the pomegranate and you the seed? Ghost, Persephone. The inky black of the mantilla I wrap over my shoulders hides my own strength, my tensed muscles. The lace whose blackness is pinpricked, starry, like a memory of the night sky. Shut as a seashell, I have become hard and savage. I play hopscotch with death, sing a dirge for the woman I could have been. I keep searching for some kind of definition. Gender, seeds. Gender, frame. Gender, scene. Gender, play. Gender, power. Gender, chest. Gender, drag. Gender, lash. Gender, nail. Gender, teeth. Gender, edge. Gender, bomb. Gender, flight. Gender, tease. This gender is not your home. Gender, needle. Gender, pill. Gender, knife. Ghost, Persephone. You and I both know Persephone was just a person trapped in the amber of one greedy mistake. It's a poor parallel, the thread you've needled between her and me. Our longest grief hangs within what's unsaid, a cool blue current I don't have the strength to swim against. Instead, I perch within brackets. It can be difficult to disentangle metaphor from myth, girl from ghost, my moth-wing life from the rush of the river flowing into the changeable sea. To find me, you must not turn back. You must not leave. Paddle your little boat out through the surf, follow the coast to the sea cave, this one hidden entrance to my underworld. Squeeze your boat through the stone's pinch, bend your body nearly double to enter this deep earth. Though you may scrape your knuckles bloody against the rough rock, do not retreat. Follow the river until the tunnel widens and you can sit up and breathe. Taste of salt, seaweed, a whiff of smoke. It takes a long time for the eyes to adjust to the unfolding dark. You could ask, when did you realize you were trans? Which is another way of asking, when did you realize you were not me? There was no one moment. Instead, there was a ripple. A flat stone skipped over calm water, a surfacing of desire, then a sinking down to the bottom. Harbor seals can dive to depths of 500 feet, remain submerged for up to 30 minutes. On a deep dive, their heart rate slows down to just 3 or 4 beats a minute. After surfacing, their heart rate speeds up, flutters faster. I didn't emerge for years. When I finally lifted up to the light, it was a kind of deep stretching. a pulling apart of the fascia that wove us together until I had removed even your name from my legal record. But still, I wonder, how toned a chest, how thick a beard, how much tea do I need? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be me? Ghost, Persephone. I have no answers. I possess a tongue, maps, night. Am I an arrow from hell, an impossible bending spoon? Estranged in this new knowledge of the earth and the starless rivers that run beneath, I can no longer return to how I was before. You swear that without me, winter. But did I choose to hide the sun from the sky? Frozen, the ground cracks with questions. I am still tossing, pulled between two worlds. It's hard to believe the same sun still rises, even after we were ripped apart. I'm going to share another gender diagram. This one was inspired by my frustration with gender reveal parties. Find your gender inside a piñata, inside a balloon, a matryoshka doll. Eject your gender out of a paint gun. Bite into this cupcake to discover your gender. Light this candle. Scratch off this card. Your gender will be seen in a smoke bomb, in the burnout from a race car, in the flash of a lightsaber, in the changing colors of a dragon egg. Launch your gender with a confetti cannon. Your gender is in an old wives' tale, fingernail polish, a locked box. Fireworks will burst your gender into the night sky. Pull your gender like a rabbit out of a hat. Thank you. I have two more poems for you. So this book is kind of all about this connection between our trans-mass speaker and his girl ghost who's in the underworld. And at a certain point, pretty late in the writing of the book, I realized that I wanted our speaker, our main speaker, to actually travel to the underworld and meet his ghost. And so that's where we're going to go. Full moon night. Sleep is impossible in the bright lunar light. The ocean glimmers, an invitation. No lantern needed. I follow my choreography of life vest, kayak, paddle. No birds sing this late. No songs I cannot translate. I crest over the waves toward the horizon. With each paddle stroke, the water glows. Bioluminescent plankton create blue swirls of sparkling light. Twin whispers of moon and sea pull me on a simple line to the sea cave, entrance to your world. My heart, dead weight, warning me to turn around. I do not listen. Instead, I flow through the booming entrance, turn my back on the prophet moon. I bow into the tunnel's tight pinch, fold my body into the unknown scream of earth and hidden light. So, as we enter the underworld, I wanted to bring both of these voices onto the page in one poem. And the form that I settled on for that is a contrapuntal, in which there's two columns of text, and each column is designed to be read either individually or simultaneously. And one thing that you can't really see when I'm reading the book out loud is that all of the poems in the voice of our transmasculine speaker are left aligned, like most traditional poetry is. And all of the voices, all the poems in the voice of the girl ghost are right aligned. And so the contrapuntal felt like the perfect form to bring these two voices together. So I'll actually read this poem twice. The first time I'll read the two voices separately, and then I'll close with reading the two voices together. Can you see? Here in the underworld, my vision plays tricks on me. I peer into a turquoise lake, a downy blue of stars above, phosphorescent swirl below, knuckles scraped on rock, a kind of magic. So burn sage and breathe. Send skyward to the night, grief or strange light. See only you, my ghost, my sister, reflection of my past. You call to me as time collapses into our one body, alive in an obad of the animal, starlit, thorn-caught, a fracturing of the poet, or a mirror smashed into shards of hidden witness, a story out of history. My body like a dream in this half-light, a cavern which holds a vast space, glowworms pulse on the walls, a soft blue light, a trickle of blood. There is no science. Burned cedar, in the flame, a prayer through rock like a door into a mirror. I look upon you, my lost self, my brother, future or present, come closer. As time unfolds, singing itself electric metamorphosis, the wild one within, we break open identity. Persephone, the moon, lunar fractals, light within us, a risen text, we spool into myth. Okay, here we go. Can you see my body? Here in the underworld like a dream, my vision plays tricks on me in this half-light. I peer into a cavern which holds a turquoise lake, a vast space, a downy blue of stars above, glowworms pulse on the walls, a phosphorescent swirl below, a soft blue light, knuckles scraped on rock, a trickle of blood, a kind of magic. There is no science, so burn sage, burn cedar, and breathe in the flame. Send a prayer skyward through rock to the night like a door into grief or a mirror. Strange light I look upon and see only you. You, my lost, my ghost self, my sister, my brother, reflection of my future, past or present. You call to me, come closer. As time collapses, as time unfolds into our one body, singing itself alive in an electrical bod of metamorphosis, the animal, the wild one, starlit within, thorn caught, we break open. A fracturing of identity, the poet or Persephone, a mirror, the moon smashed into lunar fractals, shards of light hidden within us, witness, a risen text, a story we spool out of history into myth. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian, for that terrific reading. It's an honor to be reading with you. I've never read with a hat on, but I'm going to because I was warned about the mosquitoes, which I didn't take seriously, and then got bitten on the face. So I don't normally look like this, but not much different. So, I just want to get the timing situation there. All right. Okay. Is this all right, this sound? All right. And thank you, Jane, for the introductions and for the tour of the houses. And thank you, Brooke, for inviting us to be here as part of this great festival. And thank you to the Emily Dickinson Museum. It wasn't a museum. I lived here many years ago, but it wasn't a museum. So it's kind of cool to be able to go inside. Sorry, this is why I brought the bag, because I knew I'd forget various things. Hold on. This little bag of tricks. The glasses that I didn't wear to reading last week, and I regretted it. All right. Okay, so I'm going to read from my book that came out last month, Scattered Snows to the North, and just kind of, guess I'll start. This is called Regime. As I took off my clothes, I watched him taking his own off. The sound of rain was for once not the sound of wind shaking the rain steadily loose from a stand of river birch. It's hard to believe in them, the beautiful colors of extinction. But these are the colors. Short and sweet. This is called Before All of This. And as usual, early summer seems already to hold inside it the split fruit of late fall, those afternoons whose diminished music will soon enough lie down in, surprised a little, to feel it all surprised. Meanwhile, how the wind sometimes makes the slenderest trees still young bend over makes me think of knowledge conquering superstition. I can almost believe in that until the trees, like fear, spring back. Then a sad sort of quiet just after, as between two people who have finally realized they've stopped regretting the same things. It's like they've never known each other. Yet even now, waking, they insist they've woken from a dream they share, forgetting all over again that every dream is private. Whatever the reasons are for the dead underbranches of the trees that flourish here, that the dead persist is enough. For me, it's enough. The air stirs like history, like the future, like history. This book has some poems that are named after groups of people. So, like there are gladiators, troubadours, and these are Vikings. So it's called Vikings. The Vikings thought the wind was a god, that the eyes were holes. A window meant a wind eye for the god to see with, and at the same time through. I used to hate etymology. What's the point, I'd whisper. I was quieter back then, less patient, though more easily pleased. I am pleased to have been of use, I used to say to myself, after sex with strangers. Leaning hard against the upstairs window, I'd watch them make their half-proud, half-ashamed-looking way wherever. And if it was autumn, whether in fact or only metaphorically, I'd watch the yard fill with leaves, then with what I at first thought was urgency, though it usually turned out just to be ambition. I'd leave the window open, as I do now. If closed, I open it, then pull the drapes shut across it, which, of the many I've tried, remains the best way I know still to catch a wind god breathing. I also meant to thank Kirun, for the questions that you have yet to hear, but I have a feeling are going to be great, and for being willing to be in conversation with us, though I'm also afraid of what the questions might be. This is called Refrain. Refrain. My fortress has many windows. From this one, I can tell the tide's going out. I can see the small purplish flowers further up from the water that you never stopped calling sea thistle, though that's still not right. The ring of aspens that surround my fortress, that of course know nothing of east or west or love when scattered in all its countless definitions, form a natural palisade that, in leafless months, can seem especially severe, but somehow as well inviting. How forgiveness might look in the face, say, if it had a face, and forgiveness were real. My fortress is cold and windless. It's a choice not to step from it. I believe in gift as much, I think, as I believe in mastery. Even your mistakes were delicate. All right, I mentioned, oh, never mind. Not yet. Okay, I'm going to read the title poem. So that means it's called Scattered Snows to the North. A poem that people have said, the title, they say, oh, you know, he's thinking about death and snow, mystery and memory, and okay, maybe. But it came to me from a weather report that I heard, and as soon as they said there's some scattered snows to the north of here, I thought, scattered snows to the north, I can see it. That's my title. So that's where it really came from. Okay, scattered snows to the north. Does it matter that the Roman Empire was still early in its slow unwinding into never again? Then, as now, didn't people burst into tears in front of other people, or in private, for no reason that they were willing to give, or they weren't yet able to, or for just no reason? I've never stopped missing you, I used to practice saying, for when I'd need those lines, as I assumed I would, given what I knew then, nothing really, about things like love, trust, the betrayal of trust, and a willfulness that's only deepened inside me all these years, during which I can almost say I've missed no one, though it hurts to say it. Honestly, the Roman Empire, despite my once having studied it, barely makes any sense to me now, past the back and forthing of patrolled borders as the gauge and proof of hunger's addictive and erosive powers. But there were people, of course, too, most of them destined to be unremembered, who filled in their drawn lives anyway, because what else is there, to where the edges gave out? If it was night, they lit fires, presumably. Tears were tears. Okay, I mentioned these group people. Here's some surfers. So Vikings, surfers. I see it. All right. Probably this morning's surfers aren't that much different from the ones I used to watch nearly 50 years ago, whose glamour seemed so much more fixed, more absolute from a distance than when they got too close, which is the fault not of myth, but of turning people into myth. I was a kid then, and they were more or less men. Soon they'd be men for real, meaning more or less boys. They rarely smiled at me. They never touched me. They mostly pretended not to notice me, though one time Watching them from where I'd hidden in a stretch of dune grass, I could see a couple of them with hands raised to their eyes, scanning the dunes as if searching, and I stood up, unhid myself, and I could tell they'd missed me. Toward nightfall, I'm a lighthouse. I'm a lighthouse, I'd sing to myself, but very softly, because boys aren't lighthouses. That's nonsense. Repeat after me. I could never have guessed it back then, this second life. It was all I could do just to be patient as they paddled their boards out again into the waves. Then they'd catch one, and flashing my arms, extended in front of me like the twin beams of light that softly they'd always been also, I'd guide the men in, to shore, then closer, as if there were a choice that summer, or ever, and I'd chosen, and I could almost still see it from here. Thanks. I can tell you this isn't going to last 20 minutes. I know, we're more than halfway through. But see, they told us we had to tell them ahead of time, and so, I guessed. I kept thinking, well, you'll just say things in between poems, Carl, but the thing is I don't usually because they end up being the stuff I'm saying now. So, but, so it goes. Okay, this poem is called Like So. From attention to adoration is a smallish distance, and yet no arrow, no boat with sail can cross it, like the mind's insistence. We'd reached the marshes by then that all of the dead must come to. I could see my face, tilted there, like a solar eclipse viewed indirectly, which is the proper way in a basin of water. You must hold it steady, keep the basin safe from the wind's reach, its competing powers of revelation and distortion. Now, I do have something I can say about that poem, and it ties in with why we're here. I didn't know about this idea of looking at an eclipse in a basin of water until I watched an episode of that show, Dickinson, and which I was addicted to when I was crushed when I heard it wasn't going to be renewed. But there's a show, and about her life, and it's not entirely, don't believe all of it, but I was fascinated with that, and thought, okay, I think, and thus began a path of researching eclipses and viewings and basins, and there you have it. All right, when people say, how do poems come about, that's one of the ways, if you're not listening to weather reports. So, all right, this is called Record of Where a Wind Was. Wave side, snow side, little stutter skein of plovers lifting like a mind of winter. We'd been walking the beach. Its unevenness made our bodies touch now and then, at the shoulders mostly, with that familiarity that, because it sometimes includes love, can become confused with it, though they remain different animals. In my head, I played a game with the waves called Weapon of Choice. They kept choosing forgiveness, like the one answer. As to them, it was, maybe. It's a violent world. These, I said. I choose these, putting my bare hands through the air in front of me. All right, this is called Fist and Palm. Fist and Palm. I just like doing that. Fist and Palm. I guess you have to imagine somebody, you have to imagine being a kind of horse and being ridden by your former self. That's the image. That's the image. Okay. Fist and palm. There are plenty who'd hardly recognize me now. I used to be that cruel, by which I mean I was frightened mostly, and now I'm mostly not. Joy, if only flickeringly, each day astounds me. The man I used to be dismounts, relents for a bit, before digging his boots, streaked with longing, my own longing, what I can't help, hard into my sides again, into the man I've become, his way of reminding me we've only stopped for rest, a short rest, some water. We've years to go still. He has his job. I have mine. Speechlessness is not an option, he whispers into my ear. He spits on the words themselves after, as if to make them stay, or just to make sure I'm listening. But I'm always listening, as I always obey. Isn't this obedience? These songs I've built from things too difficult to speak of. All right, so there are two more poems, and one's racing by. It's going to race by. It's called Gladiators. Each had been terrible enough to himself already, to that truest self inside, as only he could know it. So it seemed it should matter less what ways in particular they'd been terrible to each other, or even that they'd been terrible at all. Likewise, whether death mattered or not wasn't the point, had never been. They understood this now. Bird crossing sky, sky getting crossed, the sky after that. They believed about suffering that its special power is to define, even as it displaces it, everything it touches. They held on to each other. Oh, swift. We were talking at dinner about books and, to what degree we know what we're doing when we're writing towards a book or something, and I never know. I never have an idea or a theme or anything. Though one usually emerges and by the time I put poems together. But one thing that happened is I wrote, I thought, a whole bunch of narrative poems, like traditional, like a story, something happens. And I thought, okay, maybe I've turned into a narrative poet. And then when I finally got around to putting all the poems together and thinking, how many do I have and that will work, I thought, there are only 3 of these poems. And I don't know, in my head I'd written these other things. So anyway, they became like the anchors for each of 3 sections. And anyway, this is the last one of them. This last poem in the book is called Rehearsal. And then what's gonna happen, I'm gonna help you out. I'm gonna stay here, but not because I need more attention, but because I'm the segue to the Q&A. So in case you think, how come he's not leaving? That's why. Okay. This is called Rehearsal. By then, the point of the forest was the getting through it. Then it lay behind them, all but its sharper details, flies licking at dried blood, I think, on a random tree stump, getting swiftly lost. Its muffled bird song, too, that had come less, it seemed, from the trees than from beneath mostly, as if somewhere deep, deep inside the earth. Maybe meeting you has been the one good reason I lasted so long in a world that must eventually not include me, I almost said to him. Past the forest, the shore, where the land ended, where briefly the waves hitting it seemed the latest example of how squandering momentum can become routine, while upon the waves, the taken for grantedness of shadow play seemed its own example, how one way to prove power can be to quietly assume it. Then, except for offshore, where the dark lay like defiantly a ship at anchor, everything was itself, as it always had been. They took off their shoes, their clothes. They swam out to the dark ship. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you for such beautiful readings. And special thank you to the Dickinson Museum, to Jane and Brooke and Elizabeth and all the people who make this possible. And it's lovely, lovely to see so many of you. So thank you all for being here. I thought we'd, since we're in Emily's garden, I thought we'd take Dickinson as a sort of launching off point for our conversation. When Dickinson described her experience of reading Emerson's poems, she described his words as having touched a secret spring. And it's a wonderful way to sort of think about the hidden but essential parts of an imagination or of the forces that run through or beneath the poem. And I wondered if you'd each talk a little bit about the hidden springs in your own imagination and work. Whether they're other poets or places or people. Sebastian, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Is this on? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. The bulk of the book I read, at least the first draft that I read from today, was written on an island on the Maine coast. And so I think that I was very inspired by the location and being, I wrote it in, I think it was like summer of, the first big summer of COVID, so I was in pretty isolation. And I really was kind of going out every day and kayaking, and the poems would just come to me while I was out on the water, and then I'd come home and scribble them down. So I think I've always been very influenced by the natural world. And I think my location within the world. And this was very much a book that was kind of inspired by my preoccupation with gender and with trying to understand my own identity. I'd be remiss if I didn't call out my beloved husband, Dane Slutsky, who is also a poet, and he is my continual inspiration. And I couldn't have written this book without him, and he's here tonight, so thank you, Dane.
I guess it's still working, huh? Well, I mean, certainly the natural world is a big part of it. I guess it figures into a lot of the poems, but for me, but I guess, I'm really talking about like what makes the poem come into being. For me, it's like a wrestling. I think of poems for me as the kind of temporary bulwarks against what at the time seems overwhelming. And so they're kind of a stay against, I don't know, a kind of giving in to a variety of types of things. And so it's more like something has to, maybe it's like how a pearl is made or something, where something has to become a thing I'm wrestling with. And it can be something very large. It usually is like memory, which is a big part of this book, and mortality, things that I think they weigh on me more as I've stepped into retirement, and I think about what that means, but you can't pretend you're like in the middle of your life. So things like that. And my first book was that way. It was a way of understanding queerness when I didn't understand that I was queer, and and the poems were, it's not exactly poems as therapy, but sort of. It was a way of thrashing my way forward. And I thought that that would be, after I wrote the first book, I thought, well, you've solved the problem, you're queer. So now you don't have to write anything. But I have come to realize that that's not the end of the struggle. So there's always more, and it's usually that. It's not something, my friends are disappointed. They'll think, well, they'll throw a party for me and say, are you going to write about the party? And that's not what happens. I might later write about, you know, friends and betrayal or something, and I'll say, here's the party poem, but it's not the same. So.
Among your group poems that you were talking about, there's one called Troubadours. And as I was reading the book, this is one of the lines many lines that stayed with me. The poem begins, life itself being a ramble of mystery, pattern, accident, and surprise. And it struck me that that's an excellent way to think about the forces at work in a poem. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about those forces and if there are some you are drawn more to, accident or mystery, or...
All those particular ones that I
yeah.
mentioned? Well, yeah, I mean, I guess both. I mean, I'm very interested in mystery and leaving it be, on one hand, but how to live in the presence of it. And, you know, big mysteries, like what is life, what is mortality, something like that. And, but I also, I don't know, I've written a lot about risk-taking and accident and chance, and I'm interested in that and how, for me, it seems as if the poems that don't satisfy me by other people, there are plenty of poems of my own that don't satisfy me, but that's for different reasons. But when they don't satisfy me, it's because I feel as if they knew where they were going, and then they followed that line and did it, as opposed to letting themselves get a little lost and say, let's just see what happens. And so in that sense, that's what a poem seems to me, or I think that's when we surprise ourselves, because we step somewhere we didn't expect to, and something happens that may be good or bad, but it's not predictable, and it makes the poem less predictable. It's a little bit of a rambling answer.
Sebastian, maybe you might take us somewhere with pattern. One of the beautiful things about your book is the way that pattern and breaking pattern is such a part of the construction of the book. So maybe you talk a little bit about that as a force in poem making.
Ooh, yes. It's interesting, before I wrote this book, I was really obsessed with writing poems in form, like writing sonnets, sestinas, like poems that are really formal in their construction. And then I think with writing this book, I was kind of inventing my own form to fit the narrative that I was trying to tell. And one of the kind of forms that I landed on was a kind of cascade wave of lines that to me kind of replicated the feeling of the waves crashing against the shore. And then I think that I really tried to free myself from the constraints of the margin. And so at times the poems really kind of use the full space of the page, and that's particularly true in the gender diagrams. That's what I call my little gender poems. And then, as I shared in the reading, I was also interested in using the page as a way to denote to the reader who was speaking in this book that has these two distinct voices. And it's interesting because the poems that are written in the girl ghost, Persephone's voice, are much more constrained. They're much more kind of lineated in a normal fashion, or a predictable fashion, perhaps. They're mostly written in couplets or tercets. And the poems in the transmasc speaker's voice are much more likely to get a little wild and use the space of the page in different ways. And I began writing this book in grad school, and I had written a critical essay on the use of space and punctuation and caesura in the work of Frank Bedart, Sylvia Plath, and Joss Charles. And I think that kind of critical thinking about how other poets were really playing with space and punctuation really informed the writing of this book. Yeah, thank you.
When mystery or wildness or surprise doesn't come to you, or you're not finding it in your work, do you have habits you've developed over the years to lure those qualities back to the page or back to yourself? Start us.
No. But I believe that I think all of it counts as writing. So for me, if I'm not actually writing, I'm in preparation for it. I'm looking at things around me. I'm hearing songs, and I'm living in language in different ways. So I figure, because again, if I were to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to try to do these things that will make a poem come, then again, I'm not surprising myself. And so I'd rather that, and this is usually how it happens, that in the evening I'll think, I just have a feeling if I sit down right now, I'm going to write. And that wasn't the plan, and it could be 10:30, and I think, oh, I thought I was going to bed in half an hour, but I guess I'm going to be up for a few hours. And so I think sometimes that it's not a bad thing to kind of give yourself permission to not. I have a lot of friends who feel as if there's something wrong, they've lost the gift or something because they haven't written in a month or a year, and I think, well, you're getting ready. It's one way to see it. And I read a lot. I read many hours every evening. So I feel as if that's always, in some way, that's thinking about how language has been used by other people, and it's informing me, like what you said about writing the critical paper, and those ideas stay with you, and then through your own sensibility, you find yourself using them in ways you didn't expect.
I love that answer. Well, I just got back from my very first writing residency at Vermont Studio Center. I was there for 3 weeks, and I kind of went in expecting I was going to have a very specific kind of experience where I would be sitting down at my computer every day and writing beautiful, well-crafted poems. And I realized I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to utilize this experience in a specific way. And I developed 2 different practices while I was there that I found incredibly helpful. I started writing by hand rather than, I really barely used my computer while I was there. So I was writing by hand in my notebook every morning. And then I started working on this erasure project that I started working on it because I wasn't taking it too seriously. And then I got really, really, really into it. So I was doing an erasure of a history of ballet and dance, and the narrative or the story or the poems that I was extracting from that book are kind of like a new labyrinthine trans story around magic and identity that I'm planning on erasing the whole book. And I don't know, I think that just allowing myself to go towards what was most interesting to me, not towards the poems that I thought I was supposed to be writing, really helped to unlock a new creativity that I wasn't expecting to experience. Yeah.
We have many young poets in the audience, and young writers receive a lot of advice about telling the truth. Show, don't tell it all, but tell it slant, per our host. Conceal to reveal, right? And there are many, many other adages, right, about the relationship between truth and poetry, or truth and writing on the page. And I'm wondering how your own thinking about truth has evolved over the years, and what advice you give your students.
About truth and writing? I mean, I guess I think a couple of things. On one hand, I feel as if I myself want to write the poems I have to write. And what I used to tell my students all the time is, write the poems you have to write, not the ones you think you should write, or that will win a contest or be published in a magazine or whatever, but the ones that seem truest to you. And so that's one way of thinking about the truth. But I also think when it comes to poems themselves, their truths are in their sensibility, I think, in the sensibility of the author that they convey or contain. But I think about a thing that the poet Ellen Bryant Voigt said to me one time about poetry not being the transcription of an experience, but the transformation of experience. And I really believe that. I feel as if, I've just decided I'm going to sound like a poetry crank, so I'll continue in that role. When I am dissatisfied with a lot of poetry, it's because it doesn't in any way tell me something new about what I already know. I know what's going to happen. And I feel like, well, why would I want to read a poem that shows me exactly what I know the world to be, as opposed to a poem that shows me, say, something I've looked at a million times, the ocean, but when I read that poem, I think I never saw it that way. I never thought about it that way. So, so in that sense, yes, right. I guess that it matters that it's the truth, but I think that by the time things get into a poem, they've been transformed a little bit from how they may accurately be. Because the accurate picture is the one everyone already knows, I think. So I don't like saying things about poetry, and then here I am saying them. But it's just because I feel like, well, you know, everyone has a different answer, and that's not like mine's the right answer. It's more like, this is what pleases me about authenticity.
I agree that that I think the act of writing the poem itself creates a new kind of truth that is, for me, based in, like, for example, with my book, absolutely, I am a trans-masc person writing a book about trans-masculine experience. However, the speaker, I do feel as though the speaker of that book is a separate person from me, because through the act of writing, he developed his own voice that both is my voice, is informed by my experience, informed by my truth, but that through the act of writing, it became this new I, right? And similarly with the voice of Persephone in that book, I was kind of mining maybe my own curiosity about the part of myself that I had left behind in order to transition, but again, kind of placing her within that lens of Persephone, placing her within this kind of magical location of the underworld, the poetry became its own world. That book now exists as kind of another possibility of truth that's not exactly my experience. And I think that that's what I love about poetry versus writing like a nonfiction memoir, is that it creates this possibility for creativity, for play, for using not only the words themselves, but the scope of the page, the choices around line breaks, around punctuation, to evoke meaning that is distinct from the I voice that you might write in your journal. And I think that that's the real transformative power of poetry.
You know, I want to say a thing about that too, that, yeah, because even when you say that, yes, you're writing about a person that is you, but even when we're writing about that person, because I was thinking about that Surfers poem. Yes, I did watch Surfers when I was a kid, but I'm remembering that through a lens of like 50 years of experiences. And one of the things I'm interested in that book is what is true. You know, I used to think what we remember is the truth. And then you turn to someone who was also there with you and they say nothing like that happened. And you realize, how could that be? And you've gone around thinking that. So it's hard to know what the truth even is at a certain point. And so I like this idea that you sort of fashion a truth that within the world of the book is a truth, but not the truth, not the single one.
Maybe coming back to your line, accident, mistakes, surprise, right? These are part of the forces that transform whatever might have been the original idea, right, into something that a truth you didn't know, right, and get to discover on the page. I'm staying for a minute with the idea of advice that you may or may not like to give. other pieces of advice that you received as a young writer that were especially helpful, or that you had to then maybe later struggle to overturn or overthrow as you kind of grew in your writing?
Well, I think I'm able to definitely think about that and answer that. So one poet who was very influential for me was Mark Wunderlich. I was working at Bennington College, and I approached him and I said, "Can I take your poetry class as a staff member?" And he was really generous and said yes. And I remember meeting with him in his office, and I had brought these poems that I was working on, and he pointed to like one line, and he said, "This, I want you to go deeper here." And I think that what he was pointing at and what was really valuable to me is this kind of, for him as a queer poet to be looking at me and looking at my work and really encouraging me to, as we were saying before, really go into the truth, right, of who I was and what I was trying to write about. I think at that time I was really writing around the topic of my queerness. And Mark really encouraged me to delve deeper. And I think that I was in a place in my life where I was really able to receive that and to go there. And in many ways, the work I started with him in 2014 ended up becoming this book, right, in a very winding path. And I think that encouragement of trust yourself, don't worry about saying the right thing, as we were saying. Don't worry about writing the poem that you think someone else will enjoy. I mean, when I was working on this book, in many ways, I never thought it would get published because it was so unlike a traditional collection of poetry. And I really wrote the book that I needed to write, the poems that I needed to write. And it feels like such a gift that it's in the world now. So, yeah.
Well, I came to poetry sort of not in the usual way that people come to it now with, like, many people go to a writing program and get a writing degree. So I didn't really have a lot of teachers to advise me about that. But I sat in on Robert Pinsky's workshop at Boston University when I dropped out of I had a moment of weakness and thought I was going to be a PhD in classical philology. I dropped out of that after a year, and one of the things, and I should say that, so I sat in on the workshop, but my first book had just been published, which doesn't mean I didn't have a lot to learn, but I think it was helpful because I already believed in myself a certain amount. I was an older student, 32, 33. And so it's not a piece of advice. It was a piece of advice that I wisely did not do or listen to. But one of the things Robert said is, Carl, this is great what you're writing, but you're going to have to work on your sentences. They're too Mandarin, and they won't serve you well in the future. And the first thing I did is I went home, because we didn't have phones back then, and I looked up in a dictionary, what does Mandarin mean? Because I thought Mandarin was like oranges and things like that. And apparently it means like very convoluted and involved sentences that will wind and twist and turn and unnecessarily fussy, I guess. And my first thought was, well, but that's how I think and that's how I write. I can't change it. And then I thought, and Robert is a wonderful poet, but his whole thing is he writes very plain, demotic sentences. That's his whole thing. So his poems sound like how people talk on the street, and mine don't, and that's okay. So I thought, okay, I see what he's saying, but don't listen to him. And I was really glad that I was not like 23, because I think at 23 I might have said, well, I better really work on it. But sometimes you're doing the thing that people don't all get necessarily right away. So maybe that's some advice, but it's weird because in students, you want them to, of course, be open to listening and learning. But I also think they should trust themselves. And if there's something that you feel like this is absolutely who I am, then you just have to hope other people will come to get it, I guess.
Maybe we'll have one more question and then move to some questions from the audience. This one may be taking us away from poetry a little bit. When you're not writing or reading or sitting and chatting with us, where might we find you, and what kind of obsessions might you be engaged with when you're not talking about poems?
Cooking is a major part of almost every day for me, so that's a lot of it. And it's involved, it overlaps with poetry, because a lot of my ideas come while I'm doing supposedly mindless things, like chopping, peeling things. And I spend a lot of time bringing my dog to the beach, especially now that dogs can come to the beach. It's off season again. And I don't know, if it's on season, I guess swimming, going to the beach, hanging out with my partner. Yeah. Very ordinary stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I also love to cook, and I also have a dog who I love. And I love to go on walks with, her name is Daphne, and I love to go on walks with Daphne and my partner Dane. I also teach yoga, and I teach yoga here in the Valley. And I've actually found that my yoga practice really melds really well with my writing practice, because coming up with sequences kind of uses a similar creative part of my brain, but it's also this very embodied experience of both being a teacher and practicing yoga and meditating. I think that so much of my poetry is kind of about experiences and explorations of the body. And I think that my yoga practice has enabled me to really feel very connected to my body, which feels like especially important for me as a trans person. And so I really love that connection between, similarly to how I said when I was working on this book, I was kayaking every day. I think that physical movement, whether it's kayaking, going for a walk, or a yoga practice, really influences my creative brain. Yeah.
I should mention, since you mentioned your dog's name, I feel it's relevant. My dog's name she's not named after Emily Dickinson, but her name is Emily. So, but she was apparently found as a stray by a woman named Emily, and so they gave her that name. But my partner said, you should mention that when you're there. But it's just coincidental. I like the name Daphne. I think.
And we're so glad you didn't forget to mention that.
Yeah.
So thank you. Yeah. So why don't we shift to some questions from the audience, the audience here in person, and we may have some questions from online. So my colleague Brooke and I will tag team somehow.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. It was very moving reading and a very interesting Q&A. Thank you. Carl, I had a question for you, a line that struck me. I think you said, you mentioned forgiveness, if it's even real. And I just was wondering if you had something you needed to forgive or be forgiven for, or just asking for a friend.
Right. Yeah, well, I have a complicated relationship to forgiveness, and I'll say the complicated part, which is sort of implied by that line, which is mostly I don't believe in it. And the reason I don't believe in it is because for me to forgive something that someone did, I'd have to forget it, because otherwise I'd still be angry. But I know that forgiveness is supposed to be that you still remember what they did and you are okay, like you move on. But I can't. So, but as I've gotten older, I've been thinking maybe I'm wrong and maybe there is forgiveness. I don't know. But that wasn't the question, was it? Have I done things that I need forgiveness for? I mean, not in my opinion, but, I think But what I do think is true is I think it's impossible to get through a life without, at the very least, incidentally, accidentally hurting others. Even if we do the best we can, we end up sort of doing that. So I suppose that's something that, one could wish that things had not been as they were, or that you were a better person to somebody, but you were the person you had to be at the time. I mentioned being confused about queerness. I mean, so confused that I graduated from college and the very same day married the woman I'd been best friends with throughout college, and because we loved each other. But had I understood the pain that would be involved with finally understanding my queerness, coming out, getting divorced, feeling we'd been together 10 years, and it's kind of a large chunk of life. But do I want forgiveness for it? No, and I don't think she would say that that's something she, feels the need to do. I think we were happy with how our lives ended up, but at the time it seemed a mess. But is that something to forgive, or just to say it happened and we grew from it in ways, and there was pain, but that's what life is? It's not a very cheerful answer, but since you asked.
Okay. Looking for other questions?
Hi. Both of you show a great deal of vulnerability in your poetry. And I'm curious as to how you negotiate how much vulnerability to put into your poetry.
That's a good question, isn't it, Sebastian?
Well, I think one answer would be that I can't think about publishing when I'm writing. So I'm being vulnerable with myself, and then I guess I end up being vulnerable with all of you. But I think that there's also, going back to truth and integrity, it feels important to me to be who I am in the world and on the page. So I think there is vulnerability in that, but I think there's also, I think there's a lot of power in not hiding. So in some ways, it's both terrifying and also really empowering to say, this is who I am, and this is what I write. Here you go.
Yeah, I agree with that. And for me, poetry is where I go to be my truest self. The self that, all this other stuff is, this is not real, like that I'm on a stage talking to people. This isn't who I am. And so those are just the masks we put on, it seems to me. And for me, that's the thing that makes poetry so wonderful, is I get to go there. And certainly when I was writing the poems of my first book, I thought, here I can say whatever I have to say, and no one has to hear it. It never occurred to me at the time that I'd be publishing these, and and it's still that way, and it's what makes it, we talked about this a bit at dinner, it's what makes it weird then when you're standing up and thinking, well, what did you think, Carl? That you weren't going to read these? But no, I didn't think that. And then, and even after many books, where I should know, but I think, oh yeah, it still feels scary. But that seems important. I agree. There's a kind of power in that.
This one comes to you from the chat space, our friends in the ether who have questions. So were either of you exposed to poetry as children? And did that impact your identity as a poet?
Yeah, in the beginning of first of all, yes. So my mother wrote poems, like occasional poems, rhyming poems for my sisters and me. For we get a birthday poem, or we skin our knee or something. So she'd write a poem to cheer us up. And so when we went to the bookmobile, because I lived on Air Force bases for much of my childhood, and the bookmobile would come by. There wasn't a library. and it seemed a totally natural thing to get poetry books out, kids' poetry books. And so it didn't make me think about being a poet or writing poems, but it seemed a natural thing to have around the house, that poetry wasn't a strange beast.
Yeah, I grew up with the presence of my maternal grandfather's sister was the poet Amy Clampett, and so I grew up with all of her books in the house. And if you don't know her poetry, her diction is wild, and her sentence construction is just, her poems are very dense. And so I grew up kind of with these poems that I think it's taken me years to really understand. But I think that having someone in my family who had really lived the life of a poet, and what's remarkable about her is she wasn't really published until she was in her 60s, and her first published poem was in the New Yorker. And so I think that in many ways it was kind of inspiring to see that someone could strive and eventually, quote unquote, make it as a poet. And the one other thing I'll share is that I do remember, I don't know if it was like a children's collection of Emily Dickinson's poems or just a normal collection of Emily Dickinson's poems, but I do remember as a pretty young child reading her poems and, I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? I just that was electric for me. It's I think it was 7 or 8. And so Emily Dickinson's poems have also been with me from a pretty young age. And so it's such a gift to get to be here in her garden with all of you.
Hi. Both of your poems contained themes of myth and stories of old. And so I was quite curious, what draws you to myth, and what do you think about deriving truth, or at least poetic material, from myth and stories of old?
Well, I think what draws me to it is myths are archetypal, and so like these poems that you were reading, Sebastian, the Persephone, Ghost Persephone poems, this whole story of Persephone being held captive in the underworld and all of that, there's a lot of, people return to that myth a lot to talk about power and gender and rape, and so I think there's something about those stories that they resonate across centuries, and for me they can become an interesting way to talk about a contemporary situation, but with the kind of, it's like having a structure, like when you mentioned sestinas or something. In a way, a myth is like a form that you can bounce off of in some way.
Yes, I completely agree. When I was working on this book, I had the good fortune of being in a workshop with Gabby Calva-Cressy, and they said essentially that to me. They were like, you're working on these Persephone poems, you have to think about writing through the myth of Persephone as its own form. Just like when you're writing a sonnet, it has this legacy, this history. And I think the reason why I was drawn to the Persephone myth is for all the reasons that you named and why so many people are drawn to it. I think especially I was thinking a lot about grief, and there's so many kind of connotations and words associated with transition that use language around death. So often trans people will say that their former name is their dead name. And so I was really intrigued by that, and I kind of wanted to push against it. And so I think that Persephone as this figure who's neither really, she's not completely dead, she's not really alive, felt like a fitting shape or form for me to explore these concepts.
We have one last question over here, and that'll take it.
Hi, Carl, I heard you say that the title of your book didn't come to you until just emerged at the end after you were working on your book. And my question is, I kind of write that way. I don't really look at a theme. I just am very creative and write whatever I'm inspired to write. And so it seemed to me that that's what you did with your book. Is most of your writing that way? The reason why I'm asking that is because to me it seems like the trend now is to come up with a theme and then write the poems around that theme. How do both of you, do that? What's your approach? Are you inspired, or do you have any books that are based on themes?
Well, I don't. I know what you're talking about. That's kind of like a project book that people sometimes call it, and which I think is great and valid. I just don't work that way. I can only work poem by poem. So for me, what happens is I just write poems, and then every couple of years I don't know, something will happen. I'll have a feeling that I'll think, you should look at what you've written so far and see what you've got. And usually what I'll have is about 50 poems, and out of those I have this thing where I don't think, for me, I don't like any of my books to have more than about 30 poems, 34 or something like that. So I'll think, okay, see if you can find 30 here that are good enough. And sure enough, I'll get rid of a lot just because it will be that maybe I have 4 poems that are all doing the same thing, but one does it the right way, in my opinion. So then, once I've narrowed it down to those 30 poems or so, I sort of stare at them a lot and start trying to see how are they choiring together, what are they saying, and that's when I'll start to think, oh, it's interesting how you talk about memory in a lot of these poems, or it's interesting how there's this recurring figure, this image, and so that'll help me figure out how to group them. So then they find a theme, but that's not what I was planning. But I feel like anyone who writes for, once you've written like 50 poems, because it's all coming out of your head, there's going to be some thematic connection anyway. And so you just don't always know because you haven't been able to step back yet from the work. But I also think, I envy people who can do it the other way, where they have a structure already and they know what the narrative sort of arc will be, because then you can know what your job is next. Whereas my job is just, what if I'll write another poem? And, that's okay. But I think I get the feeling it was a little different for you, or at least the structure of your book necessarily is going through a journey.
I think I'm really drawn to narrative. I think I'm drawn to the lyric.
Yeah.
And then I also am really interested in storytelling. And that was certainly the case with this book. I really kind of did want to have this kind of narrative arc that we travel through. I think also my poems kind of form out of preoccupations with themes, and so I'll just kind of be writing iteratively like poems about the same thing over and over again. I have, a collection of, I think what's interesting about this being my first book is that I have all of these other poems that are more like one-off, more lyric poems that don't have a home yet, and so that might end up being like a more quote-unquote traditional collection, we'll see. And with those, it won't have the same kind of cohesive kind of narrative frame. So I do write both, but I am really drawn to storytelling. Yeah.
Well, what a splendid evening of poetry and conversation.